Hey, what's up guys? So in this video, we're going to be taking a closer look at some brand new custom firmware for the Uniden R3. It's called the R3 SE, and it adds a lot of really useful features here to the R3. It was developed by Mithru, who's also made a number of other firmware versions for different Uniden detectors, and now he's got one that's available here for the R3. And if you own an R3, I definitely think you should take a closer look here at this custom firmware. In fact, in many ways, it seems to close the gap between the R3 and the newer R4. There's some things that the R4 is going to do better. There's other things that, surprisingly, the R3 SE can actually do better than the newer R4. And so in this video, we're going to be taking a closer look here at all the new features that are available in this custom firmware. We're going to, of course, cover the differences between the R4 and the R3 SE. And then we're also going to be covering more information about the two different versions of this custom firmware. One for North American drivers and the other for New Zealand/international drivers. And so with that said, let's go ahead and take a closer look now at this custom Uniden R3 firmware called the R3 SE. All right, so starting right off, this new custom firmware is built on top of the latest firmware directly from Uniden, firmware version 1.59. Now there's two different versions here of this R3 SE custom firmware. There's one that's designed for drivers in North America, so from the United States and from Canada. It's going to be firmware version 1.64. There's also a second version of the firmware that's designed for New Zealand drivers, for international drivers, and that version is going to be 1.65. In this video, I'm going to be focusing primarily on the North American version. That's the one that I use, and it's the one that I've got loaded in here to my R3. But then after we cover kind of the different features and whatnot, I'll also talk about some of the differences available for the New Zealand version. And then after we've covered all the details regarding the R3 SE firmware version, the two different versions, then we'll finally talk about the differences between the R3 SE versus the R4. And so with that said, let's go ahead and dive into all the cool new features that are available here with this custom firmware. All right, so starting off here, you'll notice that as we boot up the detector, there's going to be a new splash screen, as well as some additional anti-theft information that's built in as well, kind of some ownership information telling everybody who this detector belongs to. And in case the detector ever gets stolen or something, it also displays an email address so that the person who finds the detector can help return the detector back to the owner. And when you purchase the firmware, you can actually let Mithru know the name that you want the detector to display at startup. And you're also going to want to provide the serial number of your R3 because the firmware that you purchase is actually tied to your specific R3. The New Zealand version of the firmware also has some additional lockdown capabilities built into this custom firmware that the North American version doesn't have, but I'll get into some more of those details after we cover kind of all the main features here of this North American version. Now, the next new feature to talk about with the R3 SE, it's giving the detector the ability to automatically adjust its sensitivity based on speed. The R4 has the feature, but it's actually more advanced and more customizable here with the R3 SE. And as a quick refresher here with the three different sensitivity modes available on the R3, you've got highway mode, as you know, which is going to be max sensitivity on all bands at all times, right? Advanced mode gives you the option to control the sensitivity of all of the individual bands. So maybe you can dial K-band sensitivity back a little bit as you like. Now, city mode is going to drop you down to minimum sensitivity on X and K-band to help kind of knock out a lot of the false alerts that you'll experience when driving around town. With the R4, when you set the detector to auto mode, it's basically going to be running at highway mode at full speed, max sensitivity, and then city mode at lower speeds, minimum sensitivity. And then with the R3 SE, on the other hand, you've actually got options to choose, well, what sensitivity mode does it run at faster speeds? What sensitivity mode does it run at lower speeds? You actually have more control over how you choose that. Here's how that's going to work. So instead of your traditional options here like advanced mode, city mode, or highway mode, there's now going to be a new menu option called Advanced Highway Mode, which is going to have the detector switch between advanced mode at lower speeds and highway mode at faster speeds. And then if you scroll over here, you're going to see there's now a new menu option called Advanced Highway Mode. And here you're just going to set the speed threshold. And so when you're driving above, let's say 45 miles an hour, it'll switch over to highway mode. And then when you slow down under the speed, it's going to drop back down to advanced mode. Now that said, there is a little bit of a buffer around this speed threshold. It's not exactly 45, but that's the general idea. Higher speeds, you're at highway mode. At lower speeds, it drops down to advanced mode instead of all the way down to city mode. Now, on the other hand, what if you do want to drop down to city mode? You want more aggressive false alert filtering around town. Well, there's ways of doing that too. To achieve that, you're going to go back into the menu, and then you're going to choose the sensitivity mode that you want when the detector is running at faster speeds. So you're either going to set the detector to advanced mode or over to highway mode. This, again, is going to be the mode that it's in when you're driving at faster speeds. And now when you scroll over, there's going to be another new menu option that opens up called Auto City Mode. And when you're running this setup, again, when you're driving around town, you're going to be at city mode for minimum sensitivity, kind of most aggressive filtering. And then at faster speeds, you can have it either bump up to advanced mode or all the way up to highway mode. And then finally, if you go back into the menu and you set it here to the city option, that's basically going to give you city mode here at all times, regardless of speed. And so again, you've now got more control here over what the different options are here at different speeds. So instead of just switching between highway mode and city mode, you can say at faster speeds, do you want highway mode or advanced mode? Alternatively, at lower speeds, instead of just going all the way down to city mode, you can do city mode or you can do advanced mode in the middle. And then if you want to disable any of these features, you can just set auto city mode to off. And then same thing here with advanced highway mode. There's an option here in the menu where you can go and just turn this mode switching option off as well. And for myself, because I don't have a lot of K-band in use in my area, I've been having it set to switch between advanced mode and city mode. And I've been liking this as a nice balance to give me reduced false alerts, both driving around at faster speeds and at lower speeds. Now, the next feature here of the R3 SE might actually be my favorite feature out of everything. It's basically going to be giving you some additional K-block options, especially one to help deal with false alerts from your Mazda CX-5s. So the R3 is natively going to come with two different K-block options. You've got one for 24.199 and a second for 24.168. However, this firmware is going to add three different additional options. You've got one for 24.160, another for your basically Mazda CX-5 range, 24.123 to 24.124, and then another one here for 24.050 to 24.079. And on top of that, there's actually going to be a sixth option available here for a custom block range. So when you reach out to Mithuru, if there's a sixth range of frequencies that you wanted to knock out, you can build in a custom K-block range here as well. And I find this option, particularly the one to help deal with the Mazda CX-5 falses, especially helpful. And the reason I say that is because the R3 can't otherwise deal with them. There is the option where you can enable MRCD, and that can help knock out some of these falses, but then that also means, especially if you don't have MRCD in your area, you're going to be getting more MRCD falses, which then you're going to have to deal with things like MRCD low-speed muting and MRCD lockouts. You kind of have to work around the other false alerts that you've introduced. With this additional K-block option, now you can just have the detector quiet down all the Mazda CX-5 falses and not have to deal with all the additional MRCD falses that you would otherwise introduce. And so this new K-block option is really helpful just to keep the detector extra quiet when you're encountering any Mazda CX-5s as you're driving around. And then in the K-block section, there's also going to be some additional options to help customize how those alerts are going to present. So for example, if you want the detector to actually beep when you get a K-block alert, you can turn it on. If you want it to be silent during a K-block alert, you can choose that here. You can also have the option if you wanted to show all of your different K-block signals when the detector is blocking them out. If you wanted to visually hide them altogether, you can do that. Personally, I think it might be a little bit risky just because police officers can also transmit on those ranges. And so I like to have the alerts shown, even if it's choosing to audibly mute it here like that. But again, you've got control now here of exactly how these detectors show up, or the signals show up rather, when the detector picks them up. Next, there's also some improvements to the manual GPS lockouts. And the change that's made here with this new firmware is they've actually doubled the size of the GPS lockout radius. So it's gone from 200 meters to 400 meters. And with the larger GPS lockout radius, that's going to be really helpful when those speed signs are like shooting all the way down the road. What can happen in that instance is you create the lockout and it locks out part of the signal, but maybe you'll pick it up before you actually get to the speed sign, before you get close enough for that lockout to kick in. So what can happen is you wind up having to create multiple GPS lockouts as you continue driving down the road. Sometimes it gets a little bit weird as you kind of go in and out between lockouts and whatnot. And so either way, with this new firmware, because the GPS lockout radius is larger, it's going to be much more likely that you can just create one GPS lockout, and that single lockout is going to be able to lock out the entire signal as you drive kind of towards that speed sign down the road. Next, there's also been a number of different improvements to the red light camera and speed camera alerts. I'll show you all the new improvements here on screen, but my favorite one is actually the POI PassChime option. With this custom firmware, we finally have a new menu option for the POI PassChime if you want to turn that chime on and off. I know there's a lot of people that have complained that like when you're passing a speed camera or something or a red light camera, the detector would actually beep and let you know maybe you don't want that chime that kind of beeps as you pass it. Previously, you'd actually have to get the R4 to be able to disable that PassChime, but now with this custom firmware, we finally have the ability to turn off that beep when you're passing the red light camera and speed cameras and whatnot. So that's a little thing, but I do find it to be very nice in practice. Next, there's also now an auto power off option if you want the detector to automatically turn itself off after you've been parked for a while. This is especially useful if you've got the detector plugged into a power source that's always hot, even when your car is parked. And so now you've actually got the feature here with the R3. Then the next change is going to be an improvement if you've got the detector's brightness set to off like this. The R3 doesn't have that little blinking dot at the bottom of the screen to let you know that the screen is still enabled or anything. And so just to give you confirmation the detector is still functioning properly and working, when you turn the detector on, you're still going to get a visual indication like that says the brightness is turned off on the display before the display goes totally dark again. Here, I'll do it one more time. I'm just going to power cycle the detector real quick. And again, you can see that it says brightness off. Again, just to let you know that yes, the detector is working, but the brightness of the display is turned off. And so those are all the improvements here with the North American version that's designed for the USA and for Canada. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, there's also another version of this firmware that's designed for New Zealand drivers, for international drivers. And this version of the firmware is going to have some changes to your GPS alerts. There's also going to be only 2 different K-block options, including one custom range, so fewer K-blocks than the North American version. Next, X-band detection is disabled altogether on the New Zealand version of the firmware. And then finally, it's also going to add some anti-theft locking capability. And with the locking capability, it's going to make it impossible to actually change what firmware is loaded onto the detector, which also, remember, has that kind of initial information at the beginning at startup that shows who the owner of the detector is. Very nice in case the detector gets stolen. With the North American version, anybody could just grab a different firmware version and just load it onto the detector, including the public one from Uniden, which would wipe out the owner information at startup. With the New Zealand version, there's actually a special locking feature where you actually have to unlock the detector, secret way to do that, before you're able to switch to any other firmware version. So there is a little bit more of like a secure lockdown method that's built into the New Zealand version that's not available on the American version. Either way, oh man, I just lost another camera. This one overheated and shut down. I'm actually on my second GoPro right now. My first GoPro overheated and shut down. Then my mirrorless camera overheated and shut off. Now I'm on my second GoPro. So let's finish this video real quick. It's only 41 degrees outside, but the sun is not fun for these cameras. So anyways, with that said, if you've got an R3, I would definitely recommend you take a look at this firmware. It is a paid upgrade. It's not free. It costs $45. And if you want it, you can just send a private message to Mithru on RDF. And I'll link to his profile down in the video description, and you can contact him in the forums. I'll also link down there to the full discussion regarding the new firmware, the different features, what all is involved, etc. And then finally, if you're looking to purchase either the R3 with the custom firmware or the R4, which is the successor to the R3, which one should you get? There's actually pros and cons to both, so let's go ahead and talk about that quickly. So as you guys know, the R4, it's got some improvements, better performance and whatnot. It's basically the R8, just without the arrows and for half the price. The R8 retails for $700. The R4 you can pick up for around $380. It's also a physically smaller detector because it doesn't have the rear-facing antenna to get the arrow functionality. The display is a little bit smaller too, but ultimately it's almost half the price of the R8 if you don't need that arrow functionality. And so at $380, I think it's a great deal. Now the R3, it's no slouch either. The R3 is going to retail for about $300, and then you're looking at another $45 to get the custom firmware. So it basically comes down to a $35 difference to go from R3 SE to R4. And all the changes that you're going to get with the R3 SE, they're purely software based. There's still a bunch of hardware advantages that you have with the R4 that firmware update alone cannot give you. For example, the R4 has the LNA to give it the longer range, so you are going to be getting better performance, longer range detection of the R4 than you can get from the R3. It's also going to add auto lockouts instead of just manual lockouts because it's got extra memory built in. The R4 also has a wider K-band scanning range, especially important for photo radar. It can scan down lower on K-band, also a hardware thing. There's an ambient light sensor built into the detector, so the display brightness can also vary based on, well, how bright it is around you, not just based on time via GPS. Then on the side of the detector, the R4 also has an extra port for Unidin's upcoming laser jammers, not yet released, but it's going to support them. The R4 is also going to support the wired control pad, something R3 is not. And then the R4 also has Bluetooth built in as well, so you can pair it with your phone, currently Android only, to add some additional functionality. And I've actually covered that in the previous video that you can check out. And so due to the hardware improvements of the R4, it's going to have a number of advantages over the R3 that a software update alone cannot give you. That said, the improvements here with the R3 SE does really help to close the gap. And in fact, it even offers some features like the more customizable auto mode, sensitivity adjustments, and the additional K-blocks. Those are things that you can't even get on the R4 at all. Additionally, for some people, hey, you may not even necessarily need some of the advantages of the R4. So let's finally just quickly talk about that. In my opinion, I think the biggest advantages of the R4 would be things like the longer range than the R3, the automatic GPS lockouts instead of just manual, and then finally you've also got the Bluetooth capability so you can pair it with your phone to add some additional features. Now that said, the range on the R3, it is still no slouch. It's still a very good performing detector, very long range. It's manual GPS lockouts, not auto, but it's not a huge deal to just train it with a double press of the mute button where all of your false alerts are around town. So after you do your initial training, it's still going to be quiet like the R4. And then finally, that Bluetooth capability, as I mentioned in the last video, that's currently only available for Android. There are no iOS apps that are available for your R4. And so if you're an iPhone user like me, the Bluetooth stuff actually doesn't really make a difference unless you want to also grab an Android phone to pair it with your detector and run highway radar with your R4. And so the R3 still has great range. Plus, as I mentioned, the R3 is still going to give you some advantages like the additional K-blocks to help quiet down those Mazda CX-5 BSMs, something that you can't get at all from the R4. And so for a lot of people to get a detector that still has great range, if you're okay with the manual lockouts and maybe Bluetooth isn't a big deal because you're an iPhone user and you're like, hey, I actually really want the Mazda CX-5 filtering, the R3 SE could be a really good choice. For others, maybe the R4 would be the way to go to get the maximum range possible, to get the auto lockouts, get Bluetooth capabilities, etc. So again, pros and cons here to both options. I'll put links to both detectors down in the video description, as well as where you can purchase the custom firmware, the R3 SE, and where you can head on over to the forums to discuss everything regarding the new firmware. And so for more information, as always, head on down to the links in the description. Thanks so much for watching. A big thank you to Mitharu for continuing to make these cool new firmware versions for a variety of different detectors. And with that said, that's it for now. Thanks so much for watching. Hope you guys are doing great, and I'll see you in the next video.